The night is too quiet. You lie still, wrapped in the coarseness of a woolen blanket, one ear turned toward the shuttered window. Beyond it, the wind stirs gently through the trees, brushing against the timber walls like fingertips testing for a way inside. Somewhere far off, an owl calls low, almost mournful. But otherwise, nothing. No footfalls, no creaking carts, no laughter from drunken tavern-goers. Only the faint scent of old smoke lingers, clinging to your clothes, your skin, the rough shawl drawn up around your shoulders. You don't move. Not yet. Your eyes are open, staring at the dark beams above, counting the seconds in silence. Waiting, watching, feeling your own heartbeat thump against your ribs, steady, but slower than before. Most are asleep by now, curled beside hearths or pressed close to loved ones. They don't know what this hour feels like, not truly. For them, night is a time of dreams. For you, it's when the world holds its breath. It's the quiet. You think about how it will end quickly if you're lucky. You think about whether they will be awake, whether their eyes will meet yours, whether they will beg, whether they will recognize the face of death, even if they don't know your name. The terrible quiet before, the street beyond is deserted. Cobblestones glisten faintly with dew. You take a breath slow, careful. The cold bites at your face but clears your mind. The fire has long since gone out. Once, they stitched wool, scraped hides, lifted baskets of herbs and berries. You were good with your hands before they learned to kill. You've taken lives that weighed heavy on your conscience, and others, well, some left no mark at all. The night swells around you cool, damp, heavy with old secrets. That, too, is a burden. A knight who returns from war with a new taste for cruelty. You've heard the stories, the ones your employers whispered before slipping you a small pouch. You want to believe them. You've done this so many times, you don't like remembering. But your hands do. You don't wear black cloaks or vanish in clouds of smoke. You walk, you watch, you wait, and still each time feels like the first. A small vial of something bitter tucked into your boot just in case. A square of cloth to stifle a scream. It's not glorious. It's not clean. The next, you were taking bread from an unattended cart. The next, you were paid to follow a man into a stable and make sure he didn't walk out. Not because of the danger, that's always there. You think about what you must do. Your hands twitch beneath the blanket. They remember more than your mind allows. The slip of a dagger into flesh, the brief resistance of bone, the warmth that follows, the sickness that took half your village, the soldiers that passed through after that, demanding what little food remained, taking more than just bread and blankets. They were not made for this once. Once, they needed dough beside your mother. And now you lie waiting, listening, a wife, perhaps not to anyone, Gran, just a man who shared your fire and fetched water with you from the stream. It could have been a simple life. The way you wrap your belt, the way you test the knife's edge, before slipping it under your sleeve, the way you tie your hair to keep it from your eyes. Each motion feels distant, practiced, like a prayer you've said too many times to still believe in. The hour is close. Too close. You shift, just slightly, careful not to make a sound. Every part of this has become ritual. No one sees you leave. You ease the door open with the edge of your cloak wrapped around your hand, muffling the creak of old hinges. It's always the same. You tell yourself it will be the last time. You tell yourself this one deserves it. Maybe he does. A man who betrays his own brother for land. A merchant who sells children to strangers for coin because it makes it easier, doesn't it? But the truth is, you don't always know. You move through alleyways, your steps light, precise. A dog barks once, then quiets. Somewhere, a door creaks and shuts again. It's not a grand life. It's not a noble one. The tools you carry are simple. A blade honed smooth by whetstone, it's work, but not the kind you speak of. You think sometimes in these quiet hours about who you could have been, a healer, maybe a mother, but simple lives are the first to break. You remember that, don't you? The winter that wouldn't end. That was the year you stopped being someone's daughter and started being someone's tool. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. One day you were helping bury the neighbor's child. You told yourself it was only this once, that it was justice. But here you are, years later, still waiting, still listening. Your hands are colder now, not from the weather. From what they've become, you reach the edge of the courtyard. There's no sound but the fountain's soft trickle. You know the window. You've studied it. 2 floors up, 3rd from the right. The shutters are closed, but not barred. A light flickers faintly behind the slats. He's still awake, every name you've forgotten. Everyone you still remember. You crouch, patient, it will be time soon. What if this is just a game between kings, and you are the piece they always sacrifice? Disappear, there's always that thought. But where would you go? And as you wait, you feel the weight again, not just of the tools on your belt, but of what they represent. You could run. You've become a shadow. And shadows don't belong in the light. Still, sometimes you wonder, tomorrow, the next night, the night after, what would you have done if there was no way out but violence? You learned to gather wild herbs. You learned where the rabbits burrowed and how to pull fish from under the reeds. You knew the names of every tree near the edge of the wood, and which ones whispered when rain was coming. They didn't bother explaining. They took food, they took blankets, they took your father. What if the person inside that room is like you once were? Hungry, desperate, trapped. A breeze passes. It smells of rain-soaked earth, of moss and old stone. You rise. Her voice was soft, like flower dust in the air. The spring rains never arrived. Mothers stopped nursing. Children grew thin and silent. How every snap of a twig feels like a scream. It was old and crusty, and the baker beat you with the heel of his boot until your cheek split open. You ran. You didn't even finish the bread. You traded herbs for scraps, told fortunes for coppers. You danced in the square, at first for fun, then for coin. You were clever with your hands. Always had been. How to tell which herb numbed pain and which could stop a heart. They dressed you in rags one day, in fine wool the next. You played parts. You became invisible. You were good at it, too good maybe. You listened. You practiced. You remembered traitors, warlords, a crowded one, noisy with drink and dice. You were dressed as a serving maid. The target was a man with a red feather in his hat. You poured his wine, and as you leaned in, you pricked the inside of his wrist with a tiny thorn dipped in something colorless and cold. Slavers. You wanted to believe them. How a riveress rush at night can sound like laughter from someone you'll never see. You watched your mother count every bean, slice every loaf into thinner and thinner pieces. Offered you a piece of cheese and a question. Did you want to learn how to survive properly? Her hands never stopped working, even when her eyes did. Your father didn't speak much. He had shoulders shaped like a yoke and hands that could crack walnuts without effort. You loved them both. Even when the winter stretched too long and the bread was thin. Even when the sickness came and took your baby brother in the middle of a snowstorm. It sat between a forest and a river, nestled in a quiet fold of land where the days passed slowly and the nights smelled of damp moss and ash. No one in your village had ever met a king. Most hadn't even seen a city. But they knew how to spin wool, how to fish, how to plant barley, and how to survive. You don't know what will happen. You never truly do. But you'll climb the wall, you'll slip through the shutter. You'll do what must be done, and then you'll lie awake again. Waiting. She had the smile of someone who'd seen too much and learned to enjoy the game anyway. She took you to a place outside the town, a crumbling barn at the edge of the woods. There were other 3 women, 2 boys. Each had that same quiet in their eyes. Not sadness exactly, not even fear, just quiet. What do you think about in the minutes before you end a life? If you're still awake, feel free to share your thoughts below. You weren't born with blood on your hands. You were born in a small house with mud-daubed walls and a low thatched roof, in a village so small it didn't appear on most maps. Your mother's hands were always moving, twisting flax, scrubbing clothes, braiding your hair while whispering old stories. You were small, but not weak. But the world beyond your village was harder, and it came for you sooner than you expected. It started with the war. Not yours, not really, but when is it ever? Soldiers came through wearing colors none of you recognized. He didn't come back. Then came the hunger. Crops failed. By the time you were 13, you were alone. You left the village because staying would have meant starving in your sleep? No one tells you how loud the world becomes when you have no roof over your head. You stole your first loaf of bread in a town 2 days' walk away. You learned quickly which alleys to sleep in, which markets had the least watchful eyes, which church doors might open when it rained. And one day someone noticed. She found you sitting near a fire behind a tannery, your arms wrapped tight around your knees. She said you had quick fingers. You were tired of being cold? You said yes. Her name was Lynn. You never knew her real one. They taught you? Not all at once. It began with small things. How to move without making sound. How to read footsteps in the mud. They taught you how to blend into smile like a washerwoman, walk like a stable girl, speak like a merchant's daughter. It wasn't called murder. Not at first. You were helping. That's what they said. Helping rid the world of men who hurt others. You didn't take your first life until your 16th year. It was in a tavern. He laughed. He flirted. He didn't know. He was dead by morning. You told yourself it was fine, that he deserved it, that you didn't really kill him, not with your own hands. But the line, once crossed, becomes easier to step over. Sometimes silence slipped in through a window like a breath. You wore disguises like second skin. You could lie better than you could speak the truth. Not even when you bathed in warm water or drank hot wine. There was something deep in your chest that stayed frozen. You learned to live with it. They gave you harder jobs after that. Not just poison, not just thorns and herbs, sometimes a blade. You didn't ask. You were too busy working, too busy surviving. You got better at it, faster, colder. You didn't do it for glory or power or even coin, though coin helped. You did it because this world didn't leave space for softness. It had taken your family, your name, your youth. And in return it gave you a blade and a roll. And yet the cold never left, not even when you sat by fires. Lynn disappeared one winter. You never found out where she went. Some say she was caught. Others think she ran. Another time you lived in a fishing village and sold baskets, but someone always recognized you. Or someone came knocking with a request. And you always said yes. No children. No innocence. At first, you thought your work would always come from someone like Lynn, someone who knew your name, who knew what you'd done, who had reasons you could almost agree with. But as the years passed, the faces changed. The messages came through others, the coin became heavier, but the lines blur. Everyone has a story. Everyone is someone's daughter, someone's son, and still you keep going, because that's what it always came back to, survival. Other times, a servant passed a sealed letter into your hand with no words, just a glance. In cities, it might come in the form of a wax-stamped note passed at a bathhouse or market. In villages, it was whispers behind the church, names, descriptions, times. Rarely more than that. You met one bishop who smelled of frankincense and oil and slid you a gold ring beneath his robe in exchange for a name scratched onto a scrap of vellum. He called it holy necessity. Who decided that this person, this woman, this man should not live to see the sun, an invisible one. One time, a noble wanted his steward gone because the man knew too much about what you were never told. Just that he had seen something. And now he couldn't be allowed to speak. There were moments you tried to leave. Once, you thought you could be a cook in a nunnery. He didn't look at you directly. He just laid a coin pouch on the table. No thanks. No reward beyond the agreed-upon silver or gold, sometimes a relic if the employer was devout. Once you received a carved wooden cross. Another time a necklace still warm from the last neck it graced, about control, about power, and said, "He's taking too much from my root. Make it stop." He meant his competitor, a boy, really. 20, maybe. Polite, always, especially those. You watched him for 2 days and saw nothing cruel in him. But the coin was already spent. Some wore righteousness like armor. You were sent to end him on the steps of a cathedral. You never learned why. He didn't scream. He just looked at you like he understood. Like he had expected this. And you wondered, as his hand slid from the stone railing, whether he knew who had sent you. Others wrapped themselves in revenge. Because how do you stop being what you were shaped into? Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. She said he had beaten her since the night they wed, that he had taken everything from her but the strength to ask you. She gave you half of everything she owned, 2 silver spoons, a ring, and a piece of cloth she'd embroidered as a girl. You still remember her eyes, not proud, not ashamed, just tired. You tell yourself you have rules, not because you want to, but because stopping is the only thing more dangerous than continuing. You never planned to kill. But life doesn't always leave you choices, only consequences. Have you ever thought about what survival looked like before safety nets? Leave a comment or follow if you want to hear more stories like this. It's strange, isn't it? How many people will pay for death without ever looking you in the eye? You learned that early, and the reasons? They disappeared. Sometimes they arrived in folded parchment tucked beneath a stone at the edge of a fountain. You learned never to ask why. It was easier that way. But sometimes when the silence grew too loud in your head, you wondered, who was behind that seal? Whose hands shook as they wrote the order? The truth is, they were rarely monsters. Not the patrons, at least. Some were priests, some were noblemen's wives, some were monks, cloaked in wool and gilt. They always had reasons. One woman asked you to kill her husband. Another job came from a merchant, round-bellied and red-faced. Sometimes it was about inheritance. A cousin removed to clear a path to land. A brother eliminated before he could return from pilgrimage. You began to realize something. It was never just about crime or justice. It was about silence. You were a blade held at someone else's throat, guided by a hand you never saw. And when it was done, there was no celebration. They paid you to be invisible, to make others disappear. Sometimes they thought it gave them power. But the truth? They feared you, even the ones who smiled when they hired you. You remember one young scribe-a-quiet man with ink-stained fingers? Most of the time, they didn't. Most of the time, you didn't. And that was the cruelest part. Because you began to see it all around you, the patterns of it. The ease with which people bartered away lives like they were livestock. The way a pouch of coin or a favor owed could become a death sentence. Not in court. Not on a battlefield, in the dark, quietly, living clean, becoming something else. But then you'd hear another whisper. See a note slipped under a door. And the work would call you back. With you, there were times you thought about walking away. Because this world, it never runs short on people who want someone gone. She wore silks and spoke with a voice like candlelight. Her request was simple. Remove a man who had seen her with someone not her husband. A chamberlain, middle-aged, faithful, and they never want to do it themselves. You saw the truth of it one autumn in a city by the sea. A noblewoman called for you. You asked her why she didn't bribe him. About how quickly history gets rewritten by the people who survive it. She smiled and said, because silence only lasts as long as fear, and the dead are never tempted. That night, as you watched her chamberlain drink alone, you thought about how many other truths he might have known. And you were just a shadow moving across parchment before the ink dried. You never saw their faces again, but they remembered yours in their final breath. Sometimes when you washed your hands after a job, you'd see their eyes in the water, not pleading, just confused. Because most of them never knew why, neither did you. Still listening? Inside, wrapped in linen, were the things you trusted most, small vials filled with bitter liquids, a thin file for sharpening blades, dried herbs crumbled so finely they could disappear into soup without a trace, a needle capped with beeswax, a blade, short and plain, worn smooth where your fingers gripped it. Think about how power works today and how many people still move in silence to protect it. Not to be feared or seen as a killer, but to be mistaken for the woman who pours the wine. You practiced on sacks of grain, then on animal carcasses from the butcher. You measured how deeply the blade had to go, how fast someone bled, how long they might last. The girl who ties the laces of a noble's boots, the quiet midwife who comes and goes with herbs in her pouch. People think the tools of an assassin are dramatic curved swords dipped in oil, elaborate traps, masks that melt into the shadows. They're wrong. Most of it is small, quiet, hidden in plain sight. A hairpin to blend, to vanish. A thimble, how to open a latch with a sliver of metal in a steady hand. So easy to slip, so easy to misjudge. How to slow your own breathing so you could hear the breaths of others on the other side of a wall. A folded kerchief that smells faintly of almonds. You learned early that the best tools were the ones no one noticed. That was the trick, wasn't it? Not to stand out. No one suspected her. And that's exactly why she was so dangerous. A serving maid's apron, a threadbare cloak with a tear at the collar, a half-worn habit of a nun, nothing elegant, nothing fine. It wasn't glamorous, it was survival. The sort of things people didn't question. You carried a small knife sewn into the hem of each. Which ones brought fever? Which ones made a person's heart simply stop? You tested them in drops, first on small animals. Then, when you had no other choice, on people who would not be missed. Your tools were like that. You carried a small leather pouch, soft from use, tucked close to your ribs. Not one of them looked special, but they could end a life faster than a knight's broadsword. You practiced endlessly. In an old barn outside town, where the roof sagged and the wind slipped through the cracks like breath, you trained your hands to be precise. You hated those lessons, but you remembered everyone. You also learned the craft of silence. How to place your foot so it made no sound even on gravel. You were taught to see without looking. And most importantly, to be prepared for everything. That meant disguises. You kept a bundle under the floorboards of every place you slept. Once you dressed as a wet nurse. Another time, a washerwoman scrubbing linens beside a river, your blade tucked in the folds of damp skirts. The poisons came later. At first you feared them. But poisons were merciful in their way, quiet, bloodless. You learned which herbs caused sleep and which caused the lungs to seize like frostbitten metal. That haunted you for a long time. Still does, but poisons offered a distance. You didn't have to watch them fall. Sometimes you were already gone by the time they began to sweat and tremble. You became skilled at hiding them, a drop on a ring, powder blown across the lip of a goblet. Once you painted it into the glaze of a ceramic dish. The target licked his fingers clean after every bite. He never finished dessert. You didn't rely on poison alone. There were times when the job required more directness, a blade across the throat. A pillow pressed firmly while no one else stirred, of iron, of fear. You come to know it like a second skin, not exactly. But you became efficient. There's nothing quiet about killing, really. No matter how soft the tool. Even if no one hears it, you do. There's the small gasp, the shift of weight, the twitch that comes before stillness, the smell of sweat. You didn't grow used to it. Quick, detached, shadows moving behind shadows. You learned never to sit with your back to a door. You memorized escape routes in every building. You practiced walking backward without sound, practiced holding your breath for a minute at a time. Before entering a room, you felt for loose boards. Before eating, you tasted nothing you hadn't prepared yourself. You slept with your back to the wall, always with something sharp within reach, even in places where you were supposedly safe. You told yourself it was mercy. The longer it takes, the worse it is. Still, you checked everything twice, sometimes 3 times. But the ones who didn't understand why. You trusted no locks but your own, no fire but the one you built. Even when you worked alone, you felt eyes watching. It was not fear. Still rolled up your shawl, still tied your boots tight, still slipped the needle into its pouch and the blade into its sheath. Just when the mark had looked at you with confusion, with familiarity, like maybe they recognized something in you, something human, it was discipline. But it felt the same, quietly, furtively, but alive. Sometimes after a job, your hands shook. Not always. Those were the ones that stayed with you. Not the cruel ones, not the proud. You'd wash your hands in the river afterward, scrubbing long after the stains had gone, and still, they felt stained. They always imagined it glamorous, but they never had to clean the blood from under their fingernails. They never had to carry their tools wrapped in linen because even the smell of them made you lose your appetite. They never had to listen to the sound of someone choking on their own breath, knowing it would be the last sound they'd ever make. You did. And still, you packed those tools every night, because that was the trade. That was the bargain you made with the world. You would do what others couldn't, for reasons you never fully understood, and in return you would live. If you're still here, take a moment to breathe. This was real life for someone once just like you. They told you not to think about them. Names don't matter, they said. Faces fade. The more you remember, the harder it becomes. And so you tried to forget. You practiced the steps, rehearsed the timing, you kept your hands busy. At first it worked. You focused on the job, the process, the routine. You studied movement, shadow, opportunity. You sharpened your blade before sunrise. Because idle hands invite memory. Still, the faces came, not always. Not all at once, humming, but in the quiet moments, those long, slow hours after the work was done, something stirred in the dark corners of your mind. You remembered the man with the chipped tooth who offered you bread before you took his life. The young noblewoman who was humming when you entered her room. A tune you still can't get out of your head. You weren't supposed to feel anything. That was the point of your training. Detach, complete, exit, the weight of someone's body crumpling against yours, the sound of breath leaving for the last time. But you're only human, flesh and blood, and your flesh remembers. It remembers the warmth of a pulse before it stopped. You didn't want to carry that with you. In your back when you lie on a hard cot, staring at the beams above, it's in your hands even when they're clean, but you do. You weren't praying, not exactly. You just wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. It's in your knees when you kneel at night. Especially when they're clean. Because it's not the blood you see, it's the absence of it. The coldness that follows. The silence. You see, it wasn't just the killing, it was the knowing. Knowing they had lives, families, secrets, maybe dreams. You never asked, but you wondered. Once, after a job in a far-off town, you wandered into a church at dusk. The way the world seemed to pause, just briefly before it fell apart. There were candles burning, wax pooling like tears on the stone. You sat on a bench at the back. And for the first time in years you wept, not loud, not long, but enough to feel the weight shift ever so slightly. There was no forgiveness in it, no release. You were born in a place where choices were few, where coin meant survival and survival meant compromise. You were small. You were quiet. You were forgettable. That your work served some greater purpose. That you were delivering justice or balance or something close to it. But there was acknowledgement. You began to dream more after that. Not of the act itself, but of the moments before. The eyes, the hesitation, and sometimes in those dreams they spoke to you. Not with anger, not always. Sometimes they just asked, why? You never had a good answer. The work chose you, or so you told yourself, perfect, and for a time you believed it was worth it. But guilt doesn't care about justification. It isn't loud. It doesn't scream or claw. It doesn't strike you down in daylight. No, it sits with you gently, like a cat at your feet. Like fog in the lungs, it waits. And in your loneliest moments, it speaks. You started writing their names down once, years after you began. Not their real names, you rarely knew those. Just a word, a symbol, something to hold on to. You kept the scraps in a pouch. One night, during a storm, you burned them all. Not out of anger, not even to forget. But because they were starting to feel like company, and that terrified you. You see, it wasn't the pain you feared, it was the comfort. Because guilt, when it becomes familiar, becomes something else. It becomes home. When you watch children run through the square, laughing with wooden swords and muddy feet. When you smelled fresh bread and for a heartbeat remembered what it was like to be young and untouched. There were good days, of course. Moments when the sky was clear and your work far behind you. But those moments were rare. Most of the time you were in between, in transit. Never arriving, never settling. You had no true friends, only contacts, no lovers, only lies. She gave you soup, a blanket, a quiet room. You told yourself it was safer that way. Maybe it was, but safety is cold company. And loneliness has a long memory. Once, during a winter assignment in the north, you stayed with a widow who didn't ask questions. You stayed 3 nights. On the second night, she asked your name. You gave her one, not yours, of course. One you hadn't used in years. She smiled, nodded, poured more broth. That night, you almost told her something true. But you didn't. You left before dawn. And for years, you thought of her whenever you tasted time. These are the things you carry. The ones you don't talk about. Not because they're shameful, but because they're yours. Your ghosts. Your consequences. You still walk with your head high. You still know how to disappear. You still keep a blade near your ankle and a story on your lips, but inside in the places no one sees. There's a weight, not heavy enough to crush, just enough to remind. Because you never forget, not really, you just keep moving. And that, perhaps, is the truest punishment of all. You survive. You endure. You live with the knowledge. And sometimes you even learn to smile again, but never quite the same way. Never without the echo. If you've made it this far with me, maybe you're wondering something. Would you have done the same? Could you have lived like this? Or perhaps you're just wondering about the woman behind the blade, the one who once laughed like anyone else, and now only does so in private. I can't answer that for you, but I can tell you this. Behind every quiet face in the market, every handmaid by the stairs, every figure in the corner of the hall, there was a life, a story, a burden. And sometimes even the ones who deal death carry the deepest sorrow. If you're still awake, I'm glad you stayed. Just rest now. Let the past settle. We'll keep going soon. They never sang songs about you. Not a single verse? Not even a whispered tale passed from bard to apprentice. About martyrs who died for glory and saints who bled for God. Oh, they sang about kings. About knights with bright armor and heavy swords. But not about you. You weren't there to be remembered. You were there to make sure someone else wouldn't be. You were the hand in the dark, the breeze at someone's neck before the world slipped away. Still, sometimes, in the stillness, you wonder what it would feel like. To be known, to be remembered. Not the real you, perhaps, but even a version, a myth, a fragment, a shadow someone kept alive in story. But you didn't leave stories behind. You left silences, though they never knew it was you. Empty chairs at council tables, unfinished letters, locks picked with no scratches, windows left ajar in houses where no one noticed until morning. They feared you, some of them. They called it accident, misfortune, disease, divine wrath. No one ever said, "Ah yes, this was her work," because your name was erased before it was ever spoken aloud. You were trained that way, taught to clean everything, tools, trails, even thoughts. To speak in suggestion, to move in implication. You were never a presence, always a possibility. Even those who hired you, who handed over coin in secret stables or smoke-filled cellars, didn't know your real name. Some called you Crow or Viper or Sister Silence. You didn't mind. Names were never meant to stick. Still, something inside you wanted more, not fame, not parades, just to be real. To be part of something, rather than a ghost slipping between the cracks of other people's lives. You remember once, years ago, passing a stone statue in the town square? It was a knight sword raised, cloak flaring behind him, face sculpted into permanent bravery. Children climbed the base. Merchants leaned against it. Birds perched on the head like it was just another ledge. No one knew who he really was, you were sure. But his name was carved deep in the plinth, a name that had survived. You sat across from that statue for hours, watching the people forget it, and yet the stone remained. You wondered, idly, what it would feel like to have your name carved into something permanent. But permanence was never part of your life. You existed in the margins. Not in ink, but in erased lines. In footnotes someone forgot to write. In questions left unanswered. And when you're gone, truly gone, no one will come looking. Your grave will be shallow, if there's one at all. Maybe a field, maybe a forest. Maybe a place where moss grows thick and no birds sing. Even the ones you spared won't know who to mourn. That used to frighten you in the early years. The idea that all of it, your choices, your risks, your regrets, might vanish without trace. Now, it only feels expected. After all, you didn't take this life to be seen. You took it because the world left you few doors, and this one happened to open. And once it opened, it never truly closed again. You told yourself stories, of course, that you were serving balance, justice, that without people like you, the world would be worse, more corrupt, more cruel. But even those ideas fade after a while. No pension. No cottage with roses at the gate. because there's no reward for surviving. You just keep going or you don't, no ledger, no map to show what you left behind. And when you don't, no one writes a song. Sometimes late at night you lie awake and think of all the lives you altered, not just those you ended. A rival removed meant another rose. A marriage not arranged, a war delayed, a fortune passed to the wrong heir. You wonder if the world tilted slightly because of you. But you'll never know. There's no reckoning, just shadows and dust. It's a peculiar thing, shaping the course of history while being erased from it. They remember the kings who gave the orders, not the hands that made the silence. And yet, without you, half those kings would have never lived long enough to be crowned. The way a mother screamed when she found you in her son's room. You were the wick that burned away unseen so the candle might glow. And now, you flicker alone. You tried once to write your story down? Just once? A few scraps of parchment tucked into a wall behind a chapel you once visited under false name. You wrote not in detail, no dates, no secrets. Just moments. The taste of sea salt near Dover. The feel of velvet gloves soaked through with rain. You sealed them in wax. Left them behind? You don't know if they were ever found. But it comforted you a little to think that someone someday might read the words and wonder who you were. Even if they never knew your name, maybe that's enough. Maybe memory doesn't need to be loud to matter. Maybe it's okay that you walked in silent so others could sleep in peace. Still, on the hardest nights you imagine a different life. One where you weren't a shadow. One where your name was known, your face familiar, your story sung. You imagine sitting at a tavern with old friends, retelling the years like a weathered sailor shares storms, laughing, remembering, being remembered. You imagine someone raising a glass and saying, "She mattered." But that life isn't yours. Yours is quieter, yours is colder. Yours is forgotten mostly, but not worthless. Because in the places where names are never carved, deeds still leave ripples, even if they vanish from sight. And somewhere, somehow, the world turns slightly because of you. If you're still listening, maybe you understand this feeling of doing your best in a world that will never truly see you. Maybe you've walked through your own quiet chapters, making choices that mattered to someone even if no one ever thanked you for them. If you have, I see you. And I hope, wherever you rest, your ghosts are gentle. And your memory, though unwritten, is held softly by the night. Will continue soon, but for now, just rest. You always thought it would end in blood. That the price of this life would be paid with steel through your ribs or poison in your cup? It's what they told you, after all. No one retires. No one just stops. But then one morning, long after the winters had started to settle into your bones, you woke up and felt it. The tiredness wasn't just in your body. It was somewhere deeper, a quiet ache you couldn't sharpen away or run from. And so, one day you didn't pick up the blade. You didn't pack your kit, or check your boots for hidden darts, or test the lockpicks tucked beneath your tunic. You sat on the edge of your bed and looked at the wooden floor and simply stayed. There was no plan, no grand scheme to escape. You just didn't show up for the meeting. Didn't answer the note left under the stone by the well. Didn't follow the mark you'd been paid to follow. You went to the market instead, bought a handful of apples. Sat under the tree behind the bakery where the sun hit just right in the afternoon. And when no one came looking for you that day, you felt something strange. Disappointment, maybe, or relief. Maybe both. You kept waiting for someone to appear in the shadows, for the retribution you were told would come. But the world stayed still. And after a week, when no message came, you packed your things and moved on. Not as a shadow, just as a woman. But you weren't anyone else, either not a wife or mother or merchant or none. You didn't know what to call yourself then. Not assassin, not anymore, cleaning, chopping wood, minding animals in exchange for food and a cot, just someone who was tired. You wandered, took work where you could. You stopped counting days. Stopped looking over your shoulder quite so often, not in shifts with one eye open, but real sleep, heavy, dreamless. You chose villages where the names didn't matter, where no one asked questions as long as you paid your share or kept the fire going. From instruments of precision to ones that scraped earth and twisted twine and held warm mugs without shaking. Your hands changed. Sometimes they remembered the shape of a dagger, but more often they remembered dough. There was a peace in it, a quiet routine. You learned how to sleep again, not curled in corners or in treetops. And when dreams did come, they weren't always of blood. Sometimes they were of rivers, of wild flowers, of hands, not weapons. You never tried to be someone else entirely. You knew that part of you would never go. The part that watched exits, that listened to silence with intent. That knew what it meant when a man carried his weight on one leg instead of two, or when a dog stopped barking too soon. You could still feel the weather in it, but it didn't define your movement. But over time, those instincts faded into the background like an old scar. You stayed in one place longer than usual once. A coastal village, sea wine thick in every crevice, gulls crying at all hours. Carved figures for children out of driftwood when their fathers were too tired from rowing. The people were simple, not stupid, just plain. Kind in the way country folk are wary at first, but generous once the rhythm was set. You helped mend nets, learned the names of fish. No one asked where you came from. Taught a few women how to listen to badas, how to spot fever in the eyes, or mend a cut without crying over it. No one cared. They just nodded when you passed and offered bread when the ovens were full. You grew herbs. One girl asked if you'd ever used a knife for anything else. You only smiled. She didn't press. There were nights, of course, when the old you returned. And someone laughed, and the world went on. When some traveler with shifty eyes came into town and the hairs on your neck rose like wind through the grass, and you'd reach reflexively for the blade that wasn't there, but then the moment passed, and the fire crackled. Once, during a storm, a merchant caravan stopped for shelter. You helped bandage a boy's broken wrist. His father, a stout man with a scar across his lip, watched you closely. His eyes lingered too long. Later, he found you behind the tavern. "I know your type," he said. You held his gaze, said nothing. He didn't push. And the last letter you never delivered. Nights when the wind reminded you of rooftops, or when someone walked past your cottage too quietly, just gave a slow nod. "Glad you're not her anymore," he muttered and walked off. And that was that. Sometimes it takes only one sentence to close a chapter. You kept a small box hidden under the floorboards. Inside were 4 things: a coin with a hole through the middle, a blood-stained ribbon, a shard of glass from a broken monocle. You opened it only on certain nights. Each item had weight not physical, but emotional, reminders of things done. Choices made, you never added to it, never took anything out either. It stayed as it was, like a quiet shrine to the life you'd survived. Years passed. Your hair grew silver, your fingers stiffened in the cold. Children who once called you Miss began to call you Auntie, and you didn't correct them. They'd ask you questions about plants and stitches and animals, but never about your past, and you were grateful for that. Because some stories don't need to be told. Some stories live only in the bones, in the quiet way someone peels an apple or watches a window a moment too long. But sometimes, when the stars were bright and the sea was calm, you let yourself imagine. Not the old days, not the kills or the secrets, but what it meant to have made it out, to have walked away. You were told that wasn't possible. But here you were, alive, not because you were the strongest or the smartest or the coldest, but because one day you chose not to be any of those things. You chose to be tired, to be done, and maybe, just maybe, that was the bravest choice of all. Now you spend your days in small things, sweeping floors, shelling peas, listening to gossip that doesn't concern you. Your muscles have softened, your scars have faded, mostly, but you carry the memory like a shadow in sunlight, never gone, just quieter. You never took another job, never wrote your story. But now and then, in the hush of evening, you light a candle and sit by the window and wonder if someone out there still remembers the woman who vanished. If there's someone walking a hard road, thinking there's no end but death, and you hope they find their way to peace, like you did. Because the truth is, you don't have to die to be done. You can leave. You can live. Even if no one ever knows your name. Even if the world never sings your song, you are still here. You've walked the long path with quiet strength, seen the world from its coldest corners, and still, you made your way here. And if you'd like to keep wandering through quiet corners of forgotten history, feel free to follow along. There's always another story waiting in the silence, not as a legend, not as a name etched in stone, but as a survivor, as someone who chose life even when life was hard to hold. If there's a lesson in all of this, perhaps it's not about daggers or disguises. Perhaps it's simply this: that peace is possible, that rest can come, even to those who once lived in shadow. So close your eyes now. You are safe, the story is told. And morning, when it comes, will be yours. And sometimes that's all that matters. And so now, as the fire grows low and the room settles into hush, let the echoes of that old life fade into the dark. If this journey stayed with you, you're welcome to leave a thought, a question, or simply a hello in the comments. I read them all.